You say one sentence, just one, and 2 seconds later, the silence on the other end already tells you there is no going back. Most people believe there is a type of person who never gets to this point. Someone philosophical, centered, who processes everything before opening their mouth. And what if I told you that the Stoics themselves, the ones who wrote the texts you might have already read, reacted badly too? Seneca wrote about anger because he himself struggled with it, not because he had already conquered it for good. So the question was never, how do I avoid reacting badly for the rest of my life? That question is impossible to answer because it requires you to stop being human. The real question, the one nobody teaches you, is, what do you do in the minutes and days after the reaction has already happened and there is no more taking it back? There is a wrong image of what it means to be stoic. The image is of someone with a closed face, who never raises their voice, who processes any loss or offense with an almost marble-like calm. That image sells courses, sells memes, sells a nice quote for social media, but it is not philosophy. It is a facade, and a facade collapses at the first real storm. The original Stoics never promised impassivity. They knew, better than we do today, that the body reacts before reason does. Epictetus was a slave before he was a philosopher, and anyone who has lived under someone else's control knows firsthand what it feels like for the body to fire off before the mind even understands what is happening. Marcus Aurelius, in Rome, and with limited power, wrote to himself every night precisely because he knew that irritation, impatience, the urge to strike back, none of that disappears just because you read a philosophy book. It stays there, in the body, ready to fire. What Stoic philosophy teaches is not never feel the impulse. It is something else. Between the impulse and the action there is a gap, a tiny, almost invisible space. And it is in that gap that you have some room to choose. But nobody has 100% control over that gap all the time. Exhaustion narrows it. A bad night of sleep narrows it. Fear of losing someone you love narrows it until it nearly closes. And when it closes, you react before you decide. And only afterward, minutes or hours later, does reason slowly arrive to assess the damage. So when you react badly, when you yell when you hurt someone, when you say what you should not have said, you did not fail as a Stoic person. You confirmed that you are human, with a nervous system that reacts faster than thought. The difference between someone who practices this philosophy and someone who does not is not found on the day they slipped. It is found the next day. It is found in what they do with the gap that reopens once the storm passes. Was there ever a time you reacted badly with someone you love? And looking back today, you know exactly what you should have done differently? Write it down below. Sometimes just putting it into words already helps you organize what still weighs on you. And if, while you read this list, a specific scene comes to mind, let it come. It will be useful for everything that follows. Hold on to that memory, because it is going to be useful for the rest of the video. Let us go through them, one by one. 5 reactions that, once they have happened, cannot be undone, and more importantly, what to do after each one. Because knowing how to name the mistake is only half the work. The other half, the one nobody teaches, is what to do in the days that follow. Before we get into the list, one thing matters. None of these 5 reactions carry the same weight in every relationship. A harsh word between siblings might be forgotten within a week. The same word between a parent and a child can echo for decades. So, as you listen to each one, think about the specific person, not the reaction in the abstract. Repair changes shape depending on who is on the other side, but the principle behind it stays the same across all 5 situations. The first is the verbal explosion. Words that hurt someone you love. There is no unsaying a sentence. You can explain yourself, give context, swear you did not mean it that way, but the sentence has already entered the other person's ear, already triggered an old memory, already mixed with everything that person feels about themselves. Sometimes since long before you. Trying to minimize it by saying I did not mean it that way usually makes things worse, because it looks like you are denying the impact instead of acknowledging it. And the person on the other side is not asking you to prove good intentions. They are asking you to recognize the effect. What to do after. Name specifically what you said. Not a generic sorry about yesterday that works for any fight with any person in any situation, but something like, I said that, and it should not have come out of my mouth. Specific acknowledgement is what restores trust, because it shows you understood the exact weight of the sentence, not just the general discomfort of having fought. And there is a second step almost nobody takes. Ask the person what that sentence stirred up in them, not to justify yourself again, but to actually listen. Sometimes the damage is not the sentence itself. It is what it confirmed about an insecurity that already existed before you. Sometimes the damage is not the sentence itself. It is what it confirmed about an insecurity that already existed before you. Some people carry, since childhood, the feeling of never being enough. And a sentence said by you, in a moment of anger, can simply confirm what that person already feared about themselves. It is not fair that your sentence carries that kind of power, but it does, and pretending it does not only delays the problem. The second is punitive silence, the distance you created on purpose. Stepping away to calm down is healthy, even recommended. Giving yourself time before continuing an argument keeps you from saying worse things, but stepping away to make the other person feel your absence is something else entirely, completely different. It is using distance as a weapon, even if you do not call it that, even if in the moment it just feels like exhaustion or the need to be quiet. What to do after? Figure out for yourself first whether that silence was emotional regulation or disguised punishment. That question is uncomfortable because the honest answer is not always pretty. If it was punishment, the repair is not just going back to talking as if nothing happened. It is naming that the silence was used that way, and that it will not become a pattern. Say it plainly. I stayed quiet longer than I needed to, and part of me wanted you to feel that. It feels like too much exposure, but that exposure is exactly what rebuilds trust, because it shows you are willing to look at the less comfortable part of your own behavior. There is a detail that helps a lot here: the length of the silence. One day of distance to sort out your feelings tends to be healthy. A week of silence already enters different territory. The territory of making the other person pay for something that maybe was not even that serious. If you notice, your silences tend to last longer than what you actually need to calm down. That is valuable information about how you handle conflict. The third is the rush decision, the cutoff. That is it, walking out and slamming the door. This one is the most dangerous of the five because it feels final. It feels like a clear decision, when in fact it was made at the peak of emotion. We are done. I never want to see you again. You are cancelled. You are no longer welcome here. Words said at the height of anger or hurt, treated afterward as if they were rational, permanent decisions, just because they were said out loud. What to do after? Separate. With all the honesty you can gather. What was an actual decision from what was a reaction of the moment? This takes time. Usually a day or two of real distance. Not anger, but reflection. If, after that time, you realize it was a reaction, you have the right to reopen the conversation and say exactly that. That came out in the heat of the moment, and I need to correct it. Not because I am weak or backing down out of weakness, but because I was inaccurate in what I said. Reopening a conversation after a cutoff is not weakness. It is the clearest proof that you know how to tell impulse apart from choice. And there is a risk on the other side too, keeping a wrong decision just out of pride, just because it was already said out loud, and taking it back feels like admitting defeat. Sticking with a bad decision just to avoid looking inconsistent is, deep down, choosing the appearance of firmness over the relationship itself. The fourth is the comparison or criticism that hit the other person's self-esteem. Unlike a single outburst, this kind of reaction goes straight into how the person sees themselves, not just how they feel in that moment. A comment about their body, their intelligence, a comparison with someone else. This kind of remark lodges itself somewhere deeper, and the effect lasts far longer than the fight itself, sometimes for years. What to do after? Here the repair cannot be verbal alone, because words already caused the problem. and words alone will hardly undo it. It needs to come with sustained action, reinforcing, in the days and weeks that follow, exactly the opposite of what was said through consistent behavior, real attention, not just one isolated apology said once and then forgotten. If you said something that hit someone's self-esteem, the repair work does not end at the apology. It begins there. A practical way to measure this is to notice whether, weeks later, the person still seems to need reassurance in the areas you targeted. If you commented on her weight and she still avoids mirrors or food in front of you, the apology has not finished the work. It has only opened the door to it. The fifth is the small revenge. The payback you did not even realize in the moment was payback. Canceling a plan at the last minute, being colder than usual, forgetting to mention something important. Small acts of retaliation that we rationalize as coincidence, as tiredness, as lack of time, but that, if you are honest with yourself, are actually a response to a hurt that has not been resolved yet. What to do after? This one is the hardest to admit, because it requires looking inward and recognizing an intention you tried to hide even from yourself before hiding it from the other person. The repair starts exactly there, in internal honesty, before any conversation with the other person even happens. Ask yourself, did I do this out of tiredness? Or did part of me want this person to feel the same discomfort I felt? Only after answering that honestly does it make sense to bring the subject into conversation. Small revenge is tricky precisely because it never feels big enough to deserve a serious conversation. And that is exactly why it can pile up, silently, until it becomes a pattern that neither of you can quite name, only feel that something has changed. Now, one important thing connects all 5 situations. In none of them is the solution to ruminate, replaying the scene over and over, punishing yourself, imagining alternate versions where you acted differently, telling yourself you are a horrible person. That is not accountability, that is decorative suffering. It looks like discipline. It looks like you are taking your own mistakes seriously, but it produces no repair at all, only wear and tear, only another layer of suffering stacked on top of the suffering you already caused. The Stoics had a concept for this. Amor fati, loving what happened. Not because it was good, not because you agree with what you did, but because it is already an accomplished fact. And the only energy truly available is the energy you use from here forward, applied to a mistake. This means accepting that the reaction already happened, without denying it, without minimizing it, without running from the discomfort of having been wrong, and redirecting all that energy of shame and guilt into a concrete act of repair. Shame that turns into rumination is pure waste. Shame that turns into a mature apology, real behavior change, consistent presence over time. That is the only productive form that heavy emotion can take. There is a thought trap that makes all of this feel useless. All or nothing thinking. I ruined everything. This relationship will never be the same again. I am just this kind of person now. Always have been and always will be. This thinking is comfortable in a perverse way. Because if everything is already destroyed, if there is no possible repair, you do not have to do the hard work of rebuilding. You just have to suffer and move on carrying the guilt. It is easier to sink into the sentence that it is all over than to take on the responsibility of slowly rebuilding. But an impulsive reaction does not define your character. Character is built in the pattern, repeated over time, not in one isolated peak of a bad day. A relationship does not break over a single moment of failure. It breaks from the repeated absence of accountability after the failure, from the missing repair, from the apology that never comes, from the change that never happens. The difference between someone who reacted badly once, on an exceptionally hard day, and someone who is just like that, who reacts badly all the time and never repairs, is not in the isolated episode. It is in what comes after it, repeatedly, over time. You do not need to be someone who never makes mistakes, because that person does not exist, never has, not even among the philosophers who wrote the texts that inspired this video. You need to be someone who, when they make a mistake, knows exactly what to do with it, knows how to name it, knows how to repair it, knows how to sustain the change over time. And that is exactly what separates impulse from character, and separates someone who only feels shame from someone who turns that shame into something that actually rebuilds what was broken. If any of these 5 situations hit close to home while you were watching, it is worth going back to the comment I asked for at the beginning, right? Not just what happened, but what you did afterward, or what you have not done yet and know you need to do. This kind of record, written in your own words, tends to help more than it seems, because it takes the weight out of your head and turns it into something concrete, something you can reread, something that can become the first real step of repair.